What horrors can a regime hide when it knows its end is inevitable? In the spring of 1945, as Allied and Soviet armies converged on the crumbling Third Reich from east and west, soldiers advancing through Germany encountered scenes that defied comprehension. The systematic genocide that Nazi propagandists had obscured through euphemism and secrecy suddenly lay exposed in its full, devastating reality. Yet even as Allied troops liberated concentration camps and documented atrocities that shocked the world, they continued discovering something equally disturbing: vast underground complexes where the SS had hidden not just stolen treasure and looted art, but evidence of crimes so extensive and systematic that they revealed the Nazi state as something unprecedented in human history, an industrial apparatus dedicated to mass murder. The discoveries came in waves, each more shocking than the last. In salt mines beneath the Austrian Alps, American soldiers found thousands of paintings stolen from Jewish families and museums across Europe. In tunnels carved into German mountainsides, they discovered factories where concentration camp prisoners had been worked to death manufacturing weapons. In hidden bunkers, they uncovered documents meticulously recording the bureaucratic machinery of genocide: lists of victims, transportation schedules for death camps, financial records tracking the systematic theft of Jewish property. And in the camps themselves, they found the physical infrastructure of industrial murder: gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, crematoria capable of burning thousands of bodies daily, warehouses filled with the belongings of the murdered: shoes, eyeglasses, human hair, gold teeth. The scale of what lay hidden underground shocked even hardened combat veterans who had witnessed years of warfare. This was not the chaos of battle or the improvised cruelty of individual sadists, but something far more disturbing: a rational, bureaucratic system designed to murder millions of people with industrial efficiency. The Nazis had not merely committed atrocities, they had created an entire apparatus for atrocity, complete with specialized facilities, trained personnel, refined procedures, and meticulous documentation. They had hidden this apparatus as completely as possible, both to maintain operational security and to obscure evidence of crimes they knew would be judged by history. The question that haunted Allied personnel who made these discoveries was fundamental. How had this happened? How had a modern European nation, heir to centuries of philosophical and cultural achievement, created such machinery of death? How had ordinary people, engineers, doctors, bureaucrats, soldiers, participated in systematic murder on an unprecedented scale? And perhaps most troubling, what did these discoveries reveal about human nature and the fragility of civilization itself? This is the story of what Allied forces found hidden underground as the Nazi regime collapsed. Not just the physical evidence of genocide, but the documentary record that revealed how the Holocaust was planned, executed, and concealed. It is the story of soldiers who thought they understood the nature of war, encountering evil that transcended anything their experience had prepared them for. And it is the story of how these discoveries forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about what human beings are capable of when ideology, technology, and state power converge in service of hatred. Understanding what Allied forces discovered in 1945 requires understanding the Nazi regime's evolution and the deliberate steps taken to conceal its crimes as military defeat became inevitable. The Third Reich that collapsed in spring 1945 bore little resemblance to the regime that had come to power in January 1933. What began as a political movement exploiting economic crisis and nationalist resentment had metastasized into something far more sinister: a totalitarian state whose core purpose was racial purification pursued through systematic murder. The transformation occurred gradually but inexorably. The early years of Nazi rule saw persecution of Jews and other targeted groups, but this persecution initially took forms that, while reprehensible, fell within the spectrum of historical persecution. Jews were excluded from professions, stripped of citizenship rights, subjected to discriminatory laws and violence. These actions prompted international criticism and caused some Jews to emigrate, but they did not yet constitute the systematic extermination that would come later. The shift toward genocide accelerated with World War II. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 brought millions of additional Jews under German control. Special mobile killing units, Einsatzgruppen, followed the Wehrmacht into Poland and later into the Soviet Union, systematically murdering Jewish populations in occupied territories. These killings, while massive in scale, were conducted openly enough that German soldiers witnessed them, local populations knew about them, and word began reaching the outside world. But even this mass murder proved insufficient for Nazi leadership. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and architect of the genocide, recognized that the Einsatzgruppen methods, shooting victims at close range, often in front of open graves, created psychological problems for the perpetrators and left evidence scattered across Eastern Europe. What the regime needed was a more efficient system, one that would kill more people more quickly, while minimizing psychological burden on perpetrators and concentrating evidence in locations that could be more easily concealed. The result was the system of extermination camps: Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. These facilities, concentrated primarily in occupied Poland, were designed specifically for industrial-scale murder. Victims were transported by rail in sealed freight cars, subjected to a selection process upon arrival, and those deemed unfit for labor were murdered within hours using poison gas. Bodies were burned in specially designed crematoria, and victims' belongings were systematically sorted, catalogued, and shipped to Germany. The entire process from arrival to cremation could be completed in less than a day. This system represented something unprecedented in human history. Previous genocides had occurred through massacre, violence that, while systematic, still retained elements of the personal and immediate. The Holocaust industrialized murder, creating bureaucratic systems that distanced perpetrators from victims and rationalized killing as a technical problem requiring efficient solution. Victims became numbers on transportation schedules. Murder became a matter of managing throughput. Genocide became an administrative task executed by specialists following procedures. The concealment of this system was deliberate and sophisticated. The extermination camps were located in occupied Poland, away from German population centers. Guards and administrators were sworn to secrecy and threatened with severe punishment for discussing their work. The camps used euphemistic language. Victims were resettled rather than murdered. Crematoria were called special facilities. Killing was special treatment. Documents used coded language that obscured their actual meaning. Photographs of the killing process were forbidden. Even the camp's existence was classified information. As Germany's military position deteriorated through 1944, SS leadership began taking additional steps to conceal evidence. When the Soviet advance threatened to overrun extermination camps in the east, the SS demolished gas chambers and crematoria at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, attempting to disguise the sites as farms. They forced prisoners on death marches westward, evacuating camps before Allied forces could reach them and document what had occurred there. They destroyed documents recording the scope of the genocide. They dispersed looted property through complex networks designed to obscure its origins. Simultaneously, the regime was hiding other forms of evidence in underground facilities throughout Germany and occupied territories. The systematic looting of Jewish property, furniture, artwork, jewelry, currency, even the gold fillings from teeth of murdered victims, had generated vast quantities of stolen goods. Art collections confiscated from Jewish families and museums represented cultural treasures worth billions. Documents recording Nazi crimes filled warehouses. Gold and currency reserves stolen from occupied countries required secure storage. The solution was to hide these materials in underground locations that could be secured, concealed, and potentially used by Nazi leadership, hoping to continue resistance after military defeat. Salt mines, with their stable temperature and humidity, were ideal for storing artworks and documents. Mountain tunnels offered secure facilities for weapons production using concentration camp labor. Purpose-built bunkers provided headquarters for Nazi leadership planning, continued resistance. By early 1945, a vast network of underground facilities existed throughout Greater Germany. Some were well-known installations like the Führerbunker in Berlin, where Hitler would spend his final days. Others were secret facilities whose locations were known only to small circles within the SS hierarchy. All represented potential hiding places for evidence that Nazi leadership hoped to conceal, or that might be useful for continued resistance. Allied intelligence possessed fragmentary knowledge of this underground network. Reports from resistance movements, interrogations of captured Germans, and aerial reconnaissance identified some facilities, but the complete scope remained unknown. What actually lay hidden underground, the quantity of stolen property, the extent of documentary evidence, the physical infrastructure of genocide, would only be revealed as Allied armies advanced through Germany and systematically investigated suspected sites. The military situation in spring 1945 created conditions for these discoveries. Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied advances from east and west. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin. American and British armies were sweeping through Western Germany. Organized German resistance was fragmenting. SS units responsible for guarding underground facilities were either fleeing, attempting to destroy evidence, or simply abandoning their posts as military defeat became undeniable. This created opportunities for Allied forces to discover and secure underground installations before their contents could be destroyed or dispersed. But it also meant that discoveries often occurred in chaotic circumstances. Troops stumbling upon facilities they hadn't known existed, finding evidence whose significance they didn't immediately grasp, liberating concentration camps whose horrors exceeded anything their experience had prepared them for. The soldiers making these discoveries were not intelligence specialists or war crimes investigators. They were combat troops whose training had prepared them for fighting, not for confronting genocide. Most had no understanding of the Holocaust's scope. While some information about Nazi persecution of Jews had reached the West, the systematic extermination remained largely unknown to ordinary soldiers. What they were about to discover would fundamentally alter their understanding of the war they had been fighting and the regime they had been fighting against. The infrastructure that Allied forces would uncover represented years of planning and construction. The salt mines that stored stolen art had been adapted with climate controls and security systems to protect valuable works. The underground factories where prisoners manufactured weapons had been carved from solid rock by workers who died by the thousands from exhaustion and malnutrition. The document storage facilities had been organized with typical German thoroughness, with filing systems designed to preserve records that simultaneously documented crimes and facilitated their commission. The personnel who operated these underground facilities came from various SS branches and civilian agencies. Some were true believers in Nazi ideology who participated eagerly in the regime's crimes. Others were careerists who saw opportunities for advancement or enrichment. Still others were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and made choices to participate, to look away, to prioritize personal safety over moral resistance that enabled atrocity. The question of how ordinary people become complicit in genocide would haunt subsequent attempts to understand the Holocaust and assign responsibility for its crimes. The timing of Allied discoveries was crucial. Had German forces succeeded in destroying more evidence, or had the war continued longer, allowing more systematic concealment efforts, the historical record of Nazi crimes would be less complete. The chaos of Germany's final collapse paradoxically served historical truth by preventing the SS from executing more thorough destruction of evidence. Documents that might have been burned were captured intact. Facilities that might have been demolished were secured before demolition could occur. Witnesses who might have been silenced survived to testify. Yet even the extensive evidence that survived represents only a fraction of what existed. The SS did succeed in destroying significant documentation and physical evidence. Many perpetrators escaped justice by fleeing or successfully concealing their involvement. The complete scope of Nazi crimes may never be fully documented because so much evidence was destroyed and so many victims left no trace beyond entries in transportation records or camp registries. The underground discoveries of 1945, shocking as they were, revealed crimes even more extensive than the physical evidence could document. The SS organization that created and concealed the underground infrastructure Allied forces discovered in 1945 had evolved from relatively modest origins into the primary instrument of Nazi racial policy. Understanding this evolution is essential to understanding both the crimes committed and the sophisticated apparatus created to conceal them. The Schutzstaffel protection squadron began in the 1920s as Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard, a small unit within the larger SA, Sturmabteilung or Storm Detachment. Heinrich Himmler assumed leadership of the SS in 1929 when it numbered fewer than 300 members. Under his leadership, the organization transformed from a minor security detail into a state within a state. a vast apparatus encompassing police functions, intelligence services, military formations, and the machinery of genocide. Himmler's vision for the SS combined racial ideology with bureaucratic rationalism. He recruited members based on perceived racial purity and ideological commitment to Nazi principles. He created an organizational culture emphasizing loyalty, obedience, and acceptance of the most extreme interpretations of Nazi racial theory. SS members were indoctrinated to view themselves as racial warriors, fighting to protect Germanic blood from contamination and to secure living space for future generations of racially pure Germans. This ideological foundation enabled the SS to undertake tasks that might have provoked resistance from more conventional military or police organizations. The SS recruited individuals willing to accept that mass murder of Jews, Roma, disabled persons, and other targeted groups was not merely acceptable, but necessary for Germany's racial survival. They created an organizational culture where questioning orders or expressing moral qualms about genocidal policies could result in punishment or removal. The SS structure that emerged by the early 1940s consisted of multiple branches with overlapping but distinct functions. The Allgemeine SS served as the organization's administrative and ideological core. The Waffen-SS constituted military formations that fought alongside the Wehrmacht while maintaining separate command structures and recruiting standards. The SS Totenkopfverbände, Death's Head units, operated concentration camps. The SD, Sicherheitsdienst or security service, functioned as intelligence and security apparatus. The Einsatzgruppen carried out mass killings in occupied territories. This organizational complexity served multiple purposes. It created specialized units with expertise in specific aspects of the Nazi program. It distributed responsibility across multiple organizations, making coordination more complex, but also obscuring individual accountability. It allowed the regime to maintain some separation between conventional military operations and genocidal activities. Though this separation was more formal than real, Wehrmacht units frequently cooperated with SS killing operations. The bureaucratic sophistication of SS operations deserves particular emphasis. The Holocaust was not, as Nazi apologists sometimes claimed after the war, a chaotic series of uncontrolled pogroms. It was a planned, coordinated operation involving multiple government agencies, requiring coordination between transportation authorities, police organizations, military units, and specialized killing facilities. The SS developed elaborate administrative systems to manage this coordination, systems that generated the documentary evidence that would later prove crucial in documenting Nazi crimes. Consider the logistics of mass deportation. Transporting millions of people from across Europe to extermination camps required coordinating with national railway systems, securing rolling stock, scheduling trains to avoid disrupting military transportation, and arranging payment for transportation services. The SS maintained offices dedicated to these arrangements, employing specialists in railway logistics who approached the deportation of Jews as a complex transportation problem requiring efficient solution. The economic dimensions of the Holocaust similarly required bureaucratic expertise. The systematic theft of Jewish property generated vast quantities of valuables requiring processing, cataloging, and distribution. The SS created administrative systems to manage this plunder, developing procedures for sorting victims' belongings, extracting precious metals, distributing useful items to German civilians, and storing valuables for later use. These systems generated detailed records, inventories, shipping manifests, financial accounts that documented the scope of theft and murder. The concentration camp system exemplified this bureaucratization of atrocity. Each camp maintained detailed records: prisoner registries, work assignments, punishment logs, death certificates. Guards and administrators filed reports documenting daily operations. Medical personnel kept records of experiments conducted on prisoners. The camps operated according to regulations specifying procedures for everything from prisoner classification to body disposal. This bureaucratic apparatus treated human beings as inventory to be processed according to standardized procedures. The individuals who operated this apparatus came from diverse backgrounds. Some were committed ideologues who joined the SS because they believed Nazi racial theories. Others were careerists attracted by opportunities for advancement that SS membership offered. Some were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and made choices to participate, to look away, to prioritize personal safety over moral resistance that enabled genocide. The question of how ordinary people become willing participants in mass murder would haunt subsequent attempts to understand the Holocaust. The training SS personnel received emphasized both ideological indoctrination and practical skills. New recruits underwent intensive ideological education designed to instill commitment to Nazi racial principles and willingness to follow orders regardless of content. They received training in the specific functions they would perform: camp guard duties, transportation security, administrative procedures. They were taught that their work, however unpleasant, served essential purposes in securing Germany's racial future. This training created psychological distance between perpetrators and victims. Jews were described not as human beings, but as racial enemies whose elimination was necessary for German survival. The killing was presented not as murder, but as a difficult but necessary task that strong men must accomplish for the future of their race. Language itself became a tool for obscuring reality. Euphemisms like special treatment and final solution allowed perpetrators to discuss mass murder without using words that might trigger moral qualms. As Germany's military position deteriorated through 1944, SS leadership began planning for a future after military defeat. Some envisioned continued resistance from Alpine redoubts, fortified positions in mountainous terrain where die-hard Nazis might continue fighting indefinitely. Others planned escape routes to sympathetic countries in South America or the Middle East. Still others focused on concealing evidence of crimes, hoping that if documentation could be destroyed and witnesses eliminated, the full scope of Nazi atrocities might remain hidden. These various plans shared the common element of requiring secure storage for valuables that might fund continued resistance or comfortable exile, and for documents that might prove embarrassing or legally dangerous if discovered. The underground facilities that the SS had been developing throughout the war, initially for weapons production and secure storage, now served additional purposes as hiding places for evidence of crimes and repositories for stolen property that might have future value. The process of concealment accelerated in early 1945. As Soviet forces advanced westward and American and British forces pressed into Germany from the west, the SS began systematically evacuating concentration camps, destroying evidence of extermination facilities, and dispersing stored materials to multiple locations to reduce risk of complete discovery. Guards received orders to shoot prisoners who could not keep pace during evacuation marches. Demolition teams destroyed gas chambers and crematoria at extermination camps. Documents were burned or moved to secure locations. Stolen property was hidden in locations known only to small circles of SS officers. This concealment campaign was partially successful. The SS did destroy much evidence and managed to hide significant quantities of stolen property, but the scale of the Holocaust made complete concealment impossible. The crime was too vast, involved too many people, generated too much documentation, and required too much physical infrastructure to hide entirely. What the SS did succeed in doing was creating confusion about the full scope of Nazi crimes, confusion that would take years to fully resolve as investigators pieced together fragmentary evidence from multiple sources. The technical expertise the SS brought to concealment reflected the same bureaucratic competence they had applied to implementing genocide. Engineers calculated how much explosive would be needed to destroy crematorium buildings. Archivists developed prioritization schemes for which documents to destroy first if time was limited. Logistics specialists planned evacuation routes and transportation schedules. The same methodical approach that had enabled industrial murder now served the goal of hiding evidence of that murder. Yet the perpetrators' efforts at concealment revealed something important. They knew what they had done was wrong. The elaborate secrecy, the coded language, the destruction of evidence as Allied forces approached, all indicated awareness that history would judge their actions harshly. This conscious concealment refutes post-war claims by some perpetrators that they didn't understand the moral enormity of their actions or that they were simply following orders without comprehending their significance. The effort to hide evidence demonstrated clear recognition that genocide was criminal and would be punished if discovered. The underground facilities and their contents that Allied forces discovered in 1945 illuminate several profound themes about the nature of genocide the capabilities and limitations of concealment, and the relationship between bureaucratic rationality and moral catastrophe. These themes extend far beyond the specific historical circumstances of Nazi Germany, touching on fundamental questions about human nature, state power, and the fragility of civilizations. The industrialization of murder represents perhaps the most disturbing innovation the Holocaust embodied. Previous genocides in history had occurred through massacre, direct violence that, while systematic, remained recognizably personal. Perpetrators confronted victims as individuals. Killing required direct action. The connection between decision to murder and act of murder remained relatively immediate. The Holocaust transformed this relationship by creating systems that distanced perpetrators from consequences of their actions. The bureaucrats scheduling deportation trains never saw the victims transported in those trains or witnessed their murder upon arrival at extermination camps. The chemist producing Zyklon B gas understood its technical properties but could rationalize that he was simply manufacturing a chemical product, not enabling mass murder. The administrator processing stolen property could convince himself he was simply managing inventory, according to established procedures. This fragmentation of responsibility allowed individuals to participate in genocide while maintaining psychological distance from the ultimate consequences of their actions. The physical infrastructure discovered underground embodied this industrialization. Gas chambers were designed by engineers who applied technical expertise to the problem of killing large numbers of people efficiently. Crematoria incorporated innovations that increased throughput and reduced fuel consumption. Transport systems moved victims according to schedules optimizing railway utilization. Storage facilities organized stolen property for efficient processing. Every aspect reflected the application of modern organizational and technical capabilities to the project of mass murder. This reveals a disturbing truth about modernity itself. The same rationalization, bureaucratization, and technical sophistication that enable modern societies to achieve remarkable productive feats can be turned toward destructive purposes with equal efficiency. The skills that in other contexts build, create, and improve can also be employed to destroy with unprecedented thoroughness. Modernity is morally neutral. It amplifies human purposes, whether those purposes are constructive or monstrous. The role of documentation in the Holocaust merits particular attention. Nazi bureaucracy generated extensive records of genocidal operations, transportation schedules, prisoner registries, death certificates, financial accounts, correspondence regarding operational details. This documentation served multiple purposes for the regime. It enabled coordination between different agencies involved in the genocide. It provided accountability within the administrative apparatus. It satisfied bureaucratic imperatives toward record-keeping that characterized modern organizations. But this documentation also created the evidence that would later prove crucial in documenting Nazi crimes. The meticulous records the SS maintained became the primary source for understanding the Holocaust's scope. The correspondence between officials planning deportations or discussing technical details of murder facilities provided insights into how decisions were made and implemented. The financial records tracking stolen property documented the economic dimensions of genocide. The very thoroughness of Nazi bureaucracy created an archive of atrocity that concealment efforts could not completely destroy. This paradox, that the same bureaucratic rationality that enabled genocide also documented it, reflects a broader tension in totalitarian systems. Such systems depend on record-keeping and administrative processes to function, but those same processes create vulnerabilities. Documents can be captured or leaked. Records reveal patterns and connections. The paper trail that enables coordination also provides evidence for prosecution. Nazi leaders recognized this paradox and attempted to address it through euphemistic language, document destruction, and restrictions on documentation of the most sensitive operations. But the scale and complexity of the Holocaust made truly secure information control impossible. The systematic theft that underground discoveries documented reveals the Holocaust's economic dimensions. The Nazi regime did not murder Jews only for ideological reasons. It also stole their property systematically. This theft occurred at multiple levels. Individual victims were robbed of everything they possessed: jewelry, currency, clothing, even the gold from their teeth. Jewish-owned businesses were Aryanized, transferred to non-Jewish ownership, usually at a fraction of actual value. Jewish-owned art collections were seized, Jewish bank accounts were frozen and confiscated, the accumulated wealth of generations was stolen and distributed among German beneficiaries. This economic plunder served multiple purposes. It enriched individual perpetrators, from SS guards stealing valuables from murdered prisoners to German civilians receiving furniture and household goods stolen from deported Jews. It provided resources for the Nazi war machine. It helped fund SS operations. It created economic incentives for participation in genocide, making the Holocaust profitable. For many Germans, reinforced ideological motivations with material self-interest. The scale of this theft was staggering. The valuables discovered in underground storage facilities, millions of dollars worth of gold, currency, jewelry, and art, represented only a fraction of what had been stolen. Much had already been distributed, spent, or converted to other forms. The total economic value extracted from Holocaust victims has been estimated at tens of billions of dollars in contemporary values. This makes the Holocaust not just a genocide, but perhaps the largest property crime in history. The physical infrastructure of the camps themselves, often partially concealed or located in areas that facilitated concealment, embodied Nazi attempts to hide genocide while conducting it. The extermination camps were located in occupied Poland, away from German population centers, where evidence might be harder to conceal. They were designed to kill victims quickly upon arrival, minimizing the number of witnesses and the duration of evidence. They used euphemistic signage and deceptive procedures, gas chambers disguised as showers, prisoners told they were being deloused, to facilitate killing and reduce resistance. Yet complete concealment was impossible given the scale of operations. The smoke from crematoria burning bodies was visible for miles. The smell of burning flesh permeated surrounding areas. Local populations observed trainloads of prisoners arriving and departing. Escaped prisoners and railway workers spread information about what occurred inside the camps. The perpetrators could obscure details, but could not hide that something monstrous was occurring. This reveals the limitations of concealment when crimes reach certain scales. Small-scale atrocities can potentially be hidden completely, witnesses eliminated, evidence destroyed, information controlled. But genocide involving millions of victims occurring across an entire continent, depending on thousands of perpetrators and witnessed by thousands more. Such crimes generate too much evidence, involve too many people, and leave too many traces to hide entirely. Nazi leadership recognized this and attempted to create confusion about specifics while maintaining operational security around key details, but their concealment campaign was fundamentally inadequate to the scale of crimes committed. The psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary people to participate in genocide represent another theme illuminated by underground discoveries. The documents and facilities revealed an apparatus of murder operated by thousands of individuals, most of whom were not ideological fanatics or sadistic sociopaths, but ordinary people who made choices to follow orders, to prioritize career advancement, to accept rationalizations for participating in atrocity that enabled genocide. Research into perpetrator psychology has identified several mechanisms that facilitate such participation. Diffusion of responsibility allows individuals to believe they are not personally accountable for outcomes they contribute to indirectly. Dehumanization of victims makes killing psychologically easier by portraying victims as less than human. Gradual escalation allows individuals to become accustomed to increasingly extreme actions through small steps rather than sudden dramatic moral compromises. Group dynamics create pressure to conform to peer behavior and organizational norms. Ideological indoctrination provides rationalizations that frame atrocity as necessary or justifiable. These mechanisms are not unique to Nazi Germany. They represent general features of human psychology that can be exploited by any regime seeking to mobilize ordinary people for genocidal purposes. This recognition is profoundly disturbing because it suggests that the potential for participation in atrocity exists in all societies under certain conditions. The Holocaust was not primarily the work of moral monsters, but of ordinary people corrupted by ideology, coerced by circumstance, or simply failing to resist evil when resistance required courage. The role of technology in enabling and concealing the Holocaust merits examination. Modern transportation systems allowed deportation of victims from across Europe. Industrial chemistry provided the poison gases used in gas chambers. Modern cremation technology enabled disposal of bodies at unprecedented scale. Communication systems coordinated operations across vast distances. Record-keeping technologies documented operations with unprecedented detail. Each technological capability served purposes the Holocaust required, yet technology also complicated concealment. Rail transport generated documents that survived to document deportations. Chemical production left paper trails connecting manufacturers to camps. Cremation facilities were physical structures that could be examined after liberation. Communications could be intercepted. Records could be captured. Technology that enabled genocide also created evidence that later documented it. This relationship between technology and atrocity raises troubling questions about technological development. Technologies are tools that can serve multiple purposes. The same railway systems that transported deportees to death camps also transported goods supporting civilian economies. The same chemical industries that produced poison gas also produced agricultural fertilizers and medicines. The same organizational capabilities that coordinated genocide also coordinated productive economic activities. Technology itself is morally neutral, but its power amplifies human purposes, whether those purposes are benign or malevolent. The actual discoveries Allied forces made as they advanced through Germany in spring 1945 came in phases, each revelation more shocking than the last. The sequence of discoveries, from hidden artworks to concentration camp evidence to detailed documentary records, progressively revealed the scope and nature of Nazi crimes in ways that transformed Allied understanding of the regime they had been fighting. The first major discoveries involved the stolen art and valuables that SS had hidden in salt mines and other underground facilities. On April 7, 1945, American forces discovered the Merkers salt mine in central Germany. Deep within the mine, in chambers protected by massive steel doors, they found over 100 tons of gold bullion, millions in currency from multiple countries, and thousands of works of art. The scale was staggering. This single facility contained more wealth than most national treasuries. The gold told its own horrifying story. Much came from central banks of occupied countries, the legitimate reserves of nations conquered by Germany. But mixed among these official reserves were more disturbing items. Thousands of gold dental fillings extracted from the mouths of murdered Holocaust victims, gold rings and jewelry stolen from deportees, even gold wedding bands. The discovery made viscerally real what had previously been abstract. The Nazi regime had systematically murdered people and melted down their gold fillings to fund war operations. The artwork similarly revealed the scope of cultural destruction the Holocaust had wrought. Paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and other masters, stolen from Jewish collectors and museums, emerged from salt mine storage. The art represented not just financial value, but the cultural heritage of families destroyed by genocide. Each painting had a story, a Jewish family that had collected it, a museum it had belonged to, the violence through which it was stolen. The artworks were witnesses to crimes, physical evidence of the systematic looting that accompanied murder. Similar discoveries followed rapidly as Allied forces advanced. The Alto See salt mine in Austria contained over 6,000 paintings, including works from the Rothschild collection and pieces destined for Hitler's planned Führer Museum in Linz. The Heilbronn mine contained thousands more artworks and documents. Underground facilities at Bernterode housed Prussian crown jewels and the remains of Prussian kings, which the SS had moved to prevent capture by Soviet forces. But as significant as these art discoveries were, they paled beside what Allied forces found in the concentration camps. The liberation of camps like Buchenwald, April 11th, Bergen-Belsen, April 15th, Dachau, April 29th, and Mauthausen, May 5, confronted Allied soldiers with horrors that exceeded anything their experience had prepared them for. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, barely alive, surrounded by corpses of those who had died in final days before liberation. Survivors told stories of systematic starvation, torture, medical experiments, and mass murder. Physical evidence, gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses full of victims' belongings, documented the industrial infrastructure of genocide. General Dwight Eisenhower, visiting Ohrdruf concentration camp on April 12th, insisted on seeing everything despite the horror it entailed. He then ordered that nearby German civilians be forced to tour the camp and witness what had been done in their name. He arranged for journalists and members of Congress to visit, recognizing that the magnitude of Nazi crimes required extensive documentation lest future generations doubt what had occurred. Photographs and film footage from the camps provided visual evidence that would become crucial in documenting the Holocaust. The documentary evidence discovered in various underground facilities and camp archives proved even more significant for understanding the Holocaust's full scope. The Nazis had maintained meticulous records of deportations, selections, and murders. As Allied forces advanced, they captured archives containing transportation schedules showing millions of Jews deported from across Europe, camp registries documenting prisoner arrivals and deaths, correspondence between officials discussing operational details of genocide, and financial records tracking stolen property. The most extensive documentary discoveries came from archives captured in Berlin and other locations as the Reich collapsed. These documents revealed the Holocaust's bureaucratic machinery, the meetings where policies were decided, the memoranda implementing those policies, the reports documenting results. The famous Wannsee Protocol, discovered in German Foreign Office archives, documented the January 1942 conference where senior Nazi officials coordinated the final solution to the Jewish question. Though the document used euphemistic language, its meaning was unmistakable. It represented a smoking gun proving that the Holocaust was planned at the highest levels of Nazi leadership. Other documents filled in details about specific aspects of the genocide. Transportation records showed how Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, had coordinated deportations. Financial records documented the systematic theft of Jewish property and its distribution. Corporate records revealed how German businesses had used concentration camp labor. Medical records documented experiments conducted on prisoners. The documentary evidence was so extensive that processing and analyzing it would occupy researchers for decades. The physical evidence in the camps themselves required careful documentation. Allied military photographers recorded conditions found upon liberation, the piles of corpses, the emaciated survivors, the gas chambers and crematoria, the warehouses containing victims' belongings. This documentation served multiple purposes. It provided evidence for potential war crimes trials. It created historical records that would allow future generations to understand what had occurred. And it offered some measure of dignity to victims whose suffering and death might otherwise have left no trace. The response to these discoveries evolved as Allied personnel processed what they were seeing. Initial reactions were often simple horror and disbelief. How could human beings do this to other human beings? How could an entire state apparatus be dedicated to such systematic cruelty? As the scope of the Holocaust became clear, these questions deepened into recognition that Nazi Germany represented something unprecedented, not just another brutal dictatorship, but a regime whose core purpose was genocide, pursued with industrial efficiency. This recognition transformed Allied understanding of the war's meaning. Before the camp liberations, World War II in Europe could be understood as a war against German aggression and militarism. The Holocaust revealed something darker, that the Allies had been fighting a regime dedicated to eliminating entire populations, that Nazi ideology was not merely extreme nationalism, but a racial program seeking to fundamentally transform human demographics through mass murder. The war had not just been about defending nations against aggression, but about preventing genocide unprecedented in scale. The question of what to do with the evidence and how to respond to the crimes confronted Allied leadership. Some advocated for summary execution of Nazi leaders and officials responsible for the Holocaust. Others insisted on trials that would document crimes through legal processes and establish precedents for holding individuals accountable for genocide. Eventually, the decision was made to convene international military tribunals that would prosecute major Nazi leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and the newly defined crime of crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, drew heavily on the documentary evidence discovered in underground facilities and camp archives. Prosecutors presented transportation schedules documenting deportations, correspondence discussing murder operations, financial records tracking stolen property, and testimony from survivors and perpetrators. The trials created an official historical record documenting Nazi crimes and establishing individual criminal responsibility. They set precedents for international humanitarian law and human rights protections that continue shaping international law today. Yet even comprehensive documentation could not fully capture the Holocaust's human dimensions. Statistics: 6 million Jews murdered, millions more killed in other targeted populations, reduce individuals to numbers. Documents record bureaucratic processes, but not the terror of victims or the choices of perpetrators. Physical evidence shows infrastructure of murder, but not the experience of those who suffered and died within it. The challenge of documentation was to create records that would enable historical understanding while acknowledging the limits of what records can convey about human suffering. The survivors themselves represented the most important documentation, living witnesses to what had occurred. Their testimony provided details that documents could not capture. They described daily life in camps, the selection process that determined who would live and who would die, the systematic cruelty, the moments of resistance and solidarity, the deaths of family members. Survivor testimony became crucial both for historical understanding and for prosecution of perpetrators. Yet bearing witness extracted its own costs from survivors, requiring them to relive trauma in service of historical truth. The property discovered underground, the stolen gold, the looted art, the accumulated belongings of millions of murdered victims raised complex questions about restitution. Who owned this property? The rightful owners were dead, often with their entire families murdered. Should property be returned to surviving relatives, to Jewish communities, to the countries from which it was stolen? These questions generated decades of legal disputes and moral debates about appropriate restitution for crimes that could never truly be repaired. The underground factories where concentration camp prisoners had been worked to death manufacturing weapons revealed another dimension of Nazi criminality: the exploitation of slave labor on unprecedented scale. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp and Siemens had used concentration camp prisoners as workers, paying the SS for their labor while working them under conditions that killed thousands. These discoveries raised questions about corporate complicity in Holocaust crimes and led to prosecutions of business leaders alongside military and political officials. The scope of the underground infrastructure itself, the miles of tunnels, the elaborate storage facilities, the secure bunkers, testified to the resources Nazi Germany had devoted to concealing its crimes even while conducting them. The effort to hide evidence was not improvised in final days of the war, but had been ongoing throughout the conflict, with facilities specifically designed for secure storage and eventual concealment. This demonstrated that Nazi leaders knew from the beginning that their actions would be judged criminal and planned accordingly. The discoveries Allied forces made in 1945 have been subject to extensive historical analysis, raising complex questions about documentation, interpretation, and the uses of Holocaust history. While the basic facts of what was found are well established, debates continue about what these discoveries meant and how they should inform contemporary understanding. The question of whether Allied governments should have known about the Holocaust sooner than they did remains contentious. Information about Nazi persecution of Jews reached the West throughout the war. Reports from escaped prisoners, resistance movements, and neutral observers described deportations and mass killings. By 1942, Allied governments possessed information suggesting that systematic extermination was occurring. Yet this information was often dismissed as exaggerated or propaganda, and Allied governments took limited action specifically to stop the genocide. This failure to respond effectively to Holocaust information reflected several factors. Allied leadership was focused primarily on winning the war militarily, and resources were directed toward that goal rather than toward specifically Jewish concerns. Anti-Semitism in Allied countries made some officials less sympathetic to Jewish suffering. The scale and systematic nature of the Holocaust exceeded what many could believe possible. Reports of gas chambers and industrial-scale murder seemed too extreme to be credible, and the information that reached Allied governments was often fragmentary and mixed with unreliable reports, making assessment difficult. Whether Allied governments could and should have done more to stop the Holocaust, through bombing railway lines to death camps, threatening retaliation against Germans involved in genocide, or providing more support for Jewish refugees, remains debated. Some historians argue that more aggressive Allied responses could have saved lives. Others contend that given military realities and political constraints, Allied governments did what they could, and that the primary responsibility for the Holocaust rests with the perpetrators rather than with those who failed to prevent it. The use of Holocaust imagery and evidence for post-war political purposes raises ethical concerns. The Soviet Union, for example, emphasized Nazi atrocities while minimizing its own crimes, including Soviet participation in the partition of Poland, the Katyn massacre of Polish officers, and Stalin's mass murders. Western allies similarly emphasized Nazi crimes, while downplaying or ignoring Allied actions that caused civilian suffering, like the bombing of Dresden. The Holocaust became instrumentalized in Cold War narratives, with each side using Nazi crimes to delegitimize the other, while obscuring morally questionable aspects of its own conduct. The Nuremberg trials, while representing important progress in international law, also faced criticism for applying retroactive justice and for being victor's justice imposed by winning powers on defeated enemies. The charge of crimes against humanity, while morally necessary to address Holocaust crimes, represented a legal innovation applied after the acts it criminalized. The tribunal was composed entirely of representatives from Allied powers, raising questions about its impartiality. Some defendants received death sentences while others received relatively light sentences for apparently similar crimes, suggesting inconsistency in justice application. Yet these criticisms, while legitimate, should not obscure the trial's accomplishments. They established precedents for holding individuals accountable for genocide and crimes against humanity. They created extensive documentation of Nazi crimes through testimony and evidence presented in court proceedings. They demonstrated that even in wartime, certain acts are so fundamentally wrong that they warrant international prosecution. And they rejected the defense that following orders absolves individuals of moral and legal responsibility for atrocities, establishing the principle that some orders are so obviously criminal that no one should obey them. The question of collective German guilt generated intense debate in post-war years. Were all Germans responsible for the Holocaust, or only those who directly participated? What responsibility did ordinary Germans bear for supporting the Nazi regime, for benefiting from Jewish property theft, or for failing to resist genocide? These questions shaped post-war reconstruction and relations between Germany and other nations, particularly Israel. The eventual German response, acceptance of historical responsibility, education about the Holocaust, payment of reparations to Israel and individual survivors represented one approach to addressing this legacy. Yet, questions remained about whether material compensation could meaningfully address crimes of such magnitude, whether post-war Germans who had not participated in the Holocaust should bear responsibility for it, and how societies should balance remembrance of historical crimes with the practical necessity of moving forward. The comparison of the Holocaust to other genocides illuminates both its unique features and its commonalities with other mass atrocities. The Holocaust was unique in its industrial scale, its systematic documentation, its use of modern technology and bureaucratic organization, and its goal of completely eliminating targeted populations. Yet other genocides, the Armenian genocide, Stalin's mass murders, Mao's Great Leap Forward, the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, share features with the Holocaust and raise similar questions about how ordinary people become willing participants in mass killing. This comparative perspective is valuable for understanding genocide as a phenomenon, rather than treating the Holocaust as so unique that no lessons can be extracted from it. The mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust, dehumanization of victims, diffusion of responsibility, gradual escalation, ideological rationalization, appear in other genocides. The warning signs, extreme rhetoric, discrimination, violence, state-sponsored persecution, recur in societies moving toward genocide. Understanding these patterns potentially enables earlier recognition and intervention when future genocides threaten. Yet comparison also risks diminishing the Holocaust's particular features or instrumentalizing it for contemporary political purposes. Invoking another Holocaust or comparing political opponents to Nazis has become so common that it often serves to end rather than advance serious discussion. The Holocaust's magnitude and particular characteristics mean that few contemporary situations truly parallel it, and claims of equivalence are usually inaccurate and offensive to Holocaust survivors and victims' descendants. The psychological and sociological research inspired by the Holocaust has significantly advanced understanding of how ordinary people participate in atrocity. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, inspired by trying to understand how Holocaust perpetrators could follow orders to commit murder, demonstrated that ordinary people will often obey authority figures even when ordered to harm others. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment showed how situational factors and assigned roles can shape behavior toward cruelty. This research illuminates disturbing truths about human psychology, that most people possess capacity for cruelty under certain conditions, that group dynamics can override individual moral judgment, that situational factors often matter more than personal character in determining whether people will participate in atrocity. These findings are both important and troubling. They help explain how the Holocaust happened without requiring that we posit that all perpetrators were moral monsters. They suggest that preventing future genocides requires attending to social and political conditions that enable atrocity rather than simply identifying and punishing evil individuals. Yet they also challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature and moral behavior, suggesting that under certain conditions, most people might participate in atrocity rather than resisting it. The role of Holocaust memory in contemporary culture and politics raises additional concerns. Holocaust education has become institutionalized in many countries, with curricula, museums, and memorial days dedicated to remembering Nazi crimes. This remembrance serves important purposes, honoring victims, educating new generations, and maintaining vigilance against recurrence of similar atrocities. Yet it also raises questions about how memory should be preserved and transmitted, whose stories should be centered, and how to maintain meaningful engagement with the Holocaust as the generation of survivors passes away. The challenge of Holocaust memory in an increasingly distant historical past requires finding ways to maintain emotional and moral engagement without reducing the Holocaust to abstract lessons or exploiting it for contemporary political purposes. Museums and memorials must balance the imperative to document historical truth with the need to create experiences that move contemporary visitors who lack direct connection to the events. Education must teach historical facts while conveying the moral significance and contemporary relevance of those facts. Memory must serve understanding rather than becoming ritualized performance that fails to genuinely engage with the past. The authenticity of underground discoveries has occasionally been questioned by Holocaust deniers who claim that evidence was fabricated or exaggerated. These claims are demonstrably false. The physical evidence, the documents, the photographs, and the survivor testimony all corroborate each other in ways that make fabrication impossible. Yet the persistence of denial, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, demonstrates how ideological commitment can override factual reality and suggests the ongoing need for historical education and documentation. The underground chambers, salt mines, and hidden bunkers that Allied forces discovered as Nazi Germany collapsed in spring 1945 contained more than stolen treasure and hidden weapons. They contained evidence of humanity's capacity for evil, executed with industrial efficiency and bureaucratic thoroughness. The discoveries shocked the world not just because of the scale of crimes they documented, but because of what they revealed about what human beings are capable of when ideology, technology, and state power converge in service of hatred. The physical evidence, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the warehouses full of victims' belongings, provided tangible proof of genocide that exceeded anything previously imagined. The documentary evidence, the meticulous records of deportations, selections, and murders, revealed the systematic, planned nature of the Holocaust. Together, these discoveries demolished any possibility of denying what had occurred and established a historical record that would enable future generations to understand, if not fully comprehend, the magnitude of Nazi crimes. Yet perhaps the most disturbing discovery was not physical evidence or documents, but rather the implication of what was found, that the Holocaust was not primarily the work of a small group of fanatics, but rather required participation, complicity, or at minimum acceptance from thousands of ordinary people. The engineers who designed gas chambers, the bureaucrats who scheduled deportation trains, the businessmen who profited from slave labor, the ordinary Germans who lived near camps and claimed they didn't know what was happening. All these individuals made choices that enabled genocide. This recognition forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human nature. The Holocaust demonstrated that ordinary people, under certain conditions, will participate in extraordinary evil. It showed that ideological indoctrination, group dynamics, and diffusion of responsibility can override individual moral judgment. It revealed that modernity's promise of progress masks a reality that modern capabilities can be turned toward destruction as easily as toward construction. And it suggested that any society under sufficiently extreme conditions might descend into genocidal violence if appropriate safeguards are not maintained. The question of what lessons the world learned from these discoveries remains complex and troubling. The international community established new legal frameworks for addressing genocide and crimes against humanity. The United Nations adopted the Genocide Convention, committing member states to prevent and punish genocide. International humanitarian law expanded to protect civilians during wartime. Human rights became a central concern of international relations in ways they had not been previously. Yet subsequent history has demonstrated the limits of these responses. Genocides occurred in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur, despite international legal obligations to prevent them. The mechanisms created to prevent atrocity have proven inadequate when faced with determined perpetrators and reluctant interveners. The Holocaust's lesson, never again, has been repeatedly contradicted by international community's failure to prevent subsequent genocides. This suggests that legal frameworks alone cannot prevent atrocity, that sustained commitment and political will are necessary to translate moral obligations into effective action. The survivors who emerged from the camps, skeletal and traumatized but alive, became living witnesses to what had occurred. Their testimony documented the Holocaust's human dimensions in ways that physical evidence and documents could not. They described the selection process that separated those who would live from those sent immediately to gas chambers. They recalled the daily humiliations and cruelties, the starvation and disease, the deaths of family members. They testified about resistance within the camps and moments of humanity that persisted despite systematic efforts to dehumanize prisoners. As survivors aged and the generation with direct memory of the Holocaust passed away, the challenge of maintaining historical memory became more acute. How do societies preserve meaningful engagement with the Holocaust when no living witnesses remain? How do educators convey the emotional and moral dimensions of the Holocaust to students for whom it is ancient history? How do commemorations avoid becoming ritualized performances that fail to genuinely grapple with the past? These questions will shape Holocaust memory and education for future generations. The gold teeth, wedding rings, and other personal items discovered in underground storage facilities, physical remnants of individual lives stolen and destroyed, perhaps best symbolize the Holocaust's personal dimensions that statistics and historical analysis cannot fully capture. Each item represented a person, someone who loved and was loved, who had hopes and dreams, who suffered and died in circumstances of unimaginable cruelty. The systematic theft of these items, extracting gold fillings from corpses, sorting victims' clothing, cataloging stolen jewelry, embodied the bureaucratic dehumanization that characterized the Holocaust. The art collections hidden in salt mines told a different but related story. The attempt to erase Jewish cultural contributions to European civilization while appropriating those contributions for German benefit. The stolen paintings represented not just financial value, but cultural heritage, the aesthetic sensibilities and collecting traditions of Jewish families whose entire lineages were destroyed. The theft was an attempt not just to murder Jews, but to erase evidence of their contributions to the societies they had lived in and enriched. The documents discovered in archives, the transportation schedules, the memoranda discussing operational details, the financial records, provided the paper trail that enabled prosecution of perpetrators and historical documentation of the Holocaust. Yet they also raised disturbing questions about the role of bureaucracy in enabling atrocity. The Holocaust was not executed by mobs engaged in frenzied violence, but by officials following procedures, coordinating between agencies, and maintaining records. This bureaucratic character, the same rationalized, organized approach that characterized modern governance generally, proved far more effective in implementing genocide than spontaneous violence could ever be. The underground facilities themselves, the salt mines, the tunnels, the bunkers, represented the Nazis' final, futile attempt to hide evidence of crimes they knew history would judge harshly. The attempt at concealment failed because the crimes were too vast, involved too many people, and left too much evidence to hide completely. Yet the attempt revealed an important truth. The perpetrators knew what they were doing was wrong. They maintained secrecy during operations and attempted to destroy evidence as defeat approached. This conscious concealment refutes claims that perpetrators didn't understand the moral enormity of their actions. They understood perfectly well, which is why they tried so desperately to hide what they had done. The Allied soldiers who liberated camps and discovered underground facilities were not prepared for what they encountered. Their training had prepared them for combat, not for confronting genocide. Many struggled for the rest of their lives with the trauma of what they had witnessed. Some dedicated themselves to documenting what they had seen, recognizing that the magnitude of Nazi crimes required extensive evidence, lest future generations doubt what had occurred. Others could not speak about their experiences, the memories too painful to articulate. The world that learned about the Holocaust through photographs, film footage, and survivor testimony struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could this occur in the 20th century, in a highly educated and culturally sophisticated European nation? How could modern civilization produce not progress, but industrial genocide? These questions forced reconsideration of assumptions about human nature, the trajectory of history, and the relationship between modernity and morality. The discoveries of 1945 established a historical record that has proven remarkably robust, despite subsequent attempts by Holocaust deniers to claim that genocide did not occur or was exaggerated. The physical evidence, the documents, the photographs, the survivor testimony, and the perpetrator's own admissions created a corpus of proof so extensive that denial requires ignoring overwhelming evidence. Yet the persistence of denial, even in the face of such evidence, demonstrates the power of ideological commitment to override factual reality, a phenomenon with continuing contemporary relevance. The question of how to remember the Holocaust, how to honor victims, how to educate future generations, how to extract moral lessons without instrumentalizing suffering, remains unresolved. The establishment of museums, memorials, and educational programs represents attempts to preserve memory and prevent recurrence. Yet memory itself cannot prevent future atrocities. Only sustained commitment to human rights, vigilance against dehumanizing ideologies, and willingness to confront injustice can reduce the likelihood of future genocides. The Nazi regime collapsed in spring 1945, brought down by military defeat and the overwhelming force of Allied armies converging from east and west. What the SS hid underground, the stolen wealth, the looted art, the documentary evidence of genocide, emerged into daylight, shocking the world and forcing confrontation with evil unprecedented in its systematic thoroughness. That evidence established a historical record that enables understanding, if not full comprehension, of how the Holocaust happened. It documented crimes so vast that they challenged existing legal and moral frameworks. And it posed questions about human nature and civilization that remain troubling and unresolved decades later. The underground chambers are now empty, their contents dispersed to museums, archives, and descendants of victims. The concentration camps are memorial sites where visitors confront the physical infrastructure of genocide. The documents fill archives where researchers continue extracting historical understanding from the bureaucratic record of atrocity. Yet the deeper meaning of what was discovered, what it reveals about human capacity for evil and the fragility of civilization, remains relevant and disturbing, a warning that the conditions that enabled the Holocaust were not unique to Nazi Germany, and that vigilance against similar evils remains necessary in every generation and every society. The lessons of the underground discoveries extend beyond historical documentation. They teach that bureaucratic systems, however rational they appear, can serve monstrous purposes. They demonstrate that technological sophistication amplifies human purposes, whether constructive or destructive. They reveal that ordinary people, under certain conditions, will participate in extraordinary evil. They show that complete concealment of crimes at industrial scale is impossible, but that perpetrators will try nonetheless. And they prove that documentary evidence, survivor testimony, and physical remains can establish historical truth even in the face of determined efforts to obscure it. As time distances us from 1945, The underground discoveries remain as witnesses to what occurred, physical proof that cannot be denied, documentary records that cannot be erased, and artistic treasures that testify to lives and cultures destroyed. They remind us that genocide is not an aberration of history, but a recurring human tragedy that requires constant vigilance to prevent. They challenge us to recognize early warning signs, to resist dehumanizing ideologies, to maintain institutions that protect human rights, and to remember that the capacity for both tremendous good and unspeakable evil exists in every human society. The world was shocked by what emerged from underground as the Nazi regime collapsed. That shock, preserved through documentation, education, and memory, must continue reverberating through generations to come, not as ritual performance, but as genuine engagement with history's darkest chapter and commitment to ensuring that such darkness never descends again.